We are back with Week 2 of Smogon Champions League, an elite tournament with tiers from Ubers to PU, Little Cup, and Smogon Doubles. Format is in the description, and we have more games this time, and we actually have 3 games from the PU tier, which had a lot of interesting development. Standings will be posted at the end of the video, and make sure to subscribe to the channel to keep up with the latest news. We are almost at 100k subscribers. Let's get right into it with Finchinator vs Lax. Finch is using a bulkier team while Lax is using a Hail team. Hail is built around Arctozolt, whose combination of Bolt Beak and Blizzard is extremely deadly. Ground types like Garchomp who switch into Bolt Beak die to Blizzard, so switching around Arctozolt is dangerous. Broadly speaking, Steel types are the way to beat Arctozolt, but the only Steel type with recovery is Corviknight, which dies to Bolt Beak. Every other Steel type like Heatran, Ferrothorn, and Melmetal don't have recovery and can get worn down over the course of the game. That's why Lax has Pokemon like Melmetal and Dragapult to try to further attack the Steel types before eventually breaking through. It's very important to understand that nuance, and it's why Finchinator is using Rotom Wash to switch into Melmetal and not something like Ferrothorn, even though both can do the job well enough. Unfortunately, Finchinator gets really unlucky, and Landorus dodges 2 Hydro Pumps and actually beats the Rotom Wash. A few turns later, Finchinator gets his Tornadus Tea frozen and he ends up having to sacrifice it too. The endgame reaches a 1 vs 2 where it's Arctozolt with Aurora Veil versus 2 Steel-type Pokemon. Heatran feints to Low Kick, but the Ferrothorn, whose health had been preserved all game, is able to beat the Arctozolt 1v1 with 1% of HP left, overcoming the bad luck. We now have another OU game between Blunder and Michael, with Blunder using a relatively uncommon Pokemon in Hydreigon. Hydreigon isn't too common mainly because of Fairy-type Pokemon, but switching into a Hydreigon can be tricky. There are many different movesets from Nasty Plot to Choice Scarf to Choice Specs to Defensive. Oftentimes you don't want to directly go into a Fairy-type because you might get hit by a strong Flash Cannon. Generally speaking, it's normal to be careful around a Hydreigon in OU because it might be running a move specifically to attempt to lure Fairy-types that try to beat it. It's common to try and pivot through a Hydreigon with Pokemon like Regenerator Tornadus Tea or Specially Defensive Landorus Tea until you figure out what it can do. Blunder understands that and snipes the Tornadus Tea out of the air with a Choice Specs Draco Meteor, even though his opponent had a Fairy type and a Steel type. Unfortunately, that brings in Clefable, who reveals Calm Mind. Earlier in the game, Michael knocked off Slowking Galar's Assault Vest and even paralyzed it, which means that it's unlikely for Slowking Galar to beat Clefable 1v1 even with the type advantage. It would have to get a lucky crit now. Furthermore, Calm Mind Clefable also runs Flamethrower for Steel types, and Corviknight doesn't often run a Steel type move. It's the perfect situation for Clefable and it becomes effectively unstoppable. Blunder has to sacrifice Choice Specs Hydreigon with Flash Cannon, Urshifu Rapid Strike, and then Corviknight just to force it out, but by then the damage is done. The lead is too big and Blunder eventually loses the game. His team would lose the week 8-2. We move to UU where we have Steve vs Clark, who's using a stall team. However, Steve has one of the better stall breakers in the tier in Flame Orb Guts Conkeldurr. Conkeldurr itself doesn't completely break stall. It takes damage every turn from the Flame Orb, and defensive Intimidate Salamence can take it on comfortably. Slowbro Galar takes 60% from Facade, so it's more of a shaky answer. However, the Conkeldurr here is paired with Wish Jirachi. Whenever Conkeldurr gets low from burn damage, it can be healed up by Wish. Furthermore, its attacking moves like Facade have a lot of PP, which means eventually it can run Salamence out of Roost. Additionally, critical hits ignore the attack drop from Salamence's Intimidate, which can make it a shaky check too. Conkeldurr can repeatedly enter the game because the stall team doesn't have a lot of offense to stop it from coming in, and that means it's going to have a lot of chances to fish for the critical hit. As it happens, Conkeldurr stays in on a Salamence trying to roost and nails it with a critical hit Drain Punch. Now there's nothing to intimidate Conkeldurr, and there's nothing immune to Diggersby's Earthquake. Still though, the game is far from over. Slowbro Galar comes in, and even though Conkeldurr can do 60% to it, it's not the best fight to take on 1v1. Slowbro reveals Calm Mind, and it's very painful to deal with. Diggersby's Earthquake does not one-hit KO Slowbro Galar, and it can threaten Diggersby with Scald. Chansey takes little damage from Slowbro, even at maxed out special attack, but it has to be scared of Sludge Bomb Poison. In theory, you can try and PP stall the Slowbro by switching out every time you get Sludge Bomb poisoned, but it's not realistic. Unfortunately, the Chansey gets hit by a critical hit Sludge Bomb Poison and faints. Diggersby comes in to force it out, and from here it's tough for Clark. Slowbro Galar comes back in later, and in fact does get a Scald Burn on Diggersby, but then the next time it tries to come in, it gets flinched down by Jirachi. Even with regen switching, Conkeldurr is tough to beat at this point and takes the next 10 turns to break through the team, leading to the win. We move to NU, where we have PokéMMD versus Kushalos, one of the top NU players. Rotom-Mow is an interesting Pokemon, and it's good because of the Grass-Electric combination. You need a Ground type to switch into Volt Switch, but Rotom-Mow can hit that Ground type with a powerful Leaf Storm. Rotom-Mow often uses Choice Specs or Choice Scarf and turns into a deadly pivot. Partly for this reason, it's not uncommon for Ground types to use Protect to ease the burden of trying to predict around Volt Switch. Pokémon takes advantage and reveals he's not Volt Switch Rotom, but actually Nasty Plot Thunderbolt. He uses the Protect turn to Nasty Plot up and parlays it into knocking out Copperajah before being forced to switch out by Salazzle. An early advantage, but this game is mainly going to be about Bulk Up, Rest, Shed Skin, Scrafty. Talonflame often runs a defensive moveset with Flame Body. That means if Scrafty can get enough Bulk Ups, it can actually beat Talonflame. Talonflame and Weezing rely on status conditions to beat fighting types, so even though they have the type advantage, they lose to Scrafty. Scrafty can simply rest off weak attacks and Shed Skin status conditions. Pokémon's Taunt, Willow, Talonflame loses to Scrafty, but not before reducing its health and forcing it to switch out. If Rotom-Mow can knock out Scrafty, Pokémon can win the game. But if Scrafty can beat Rotom and then use Rest with Shed Skin, Scrafty wins the game. Pokémon's first Leaf Storm does 40, which means its next attack will be a range somewhere around 20 depending on the EV spreads, which we don't know yet. Pokémon gets to 22, knocking out Kushalos' biggest threat, Scrafty. From there, Pokémon goes on to clean up and converts the win to move to 2-0 on the season. We now have 3 games from the PU tier which had a lot of action today. We see a hyper-offensive team with Lead, Quillfish, and Thwackey. As a reminder, the PU tier happens to be a low enough tier where there's an intersection where EV-Light versions of top-tier fully evolved Pokemon can handle themselves against the weaker fully evolved Pokemon. We see Meteor Beam Archeops, which uses its weaker special attack but has the surprise factor to knock out physically defensive Pokemon. Unfortunately, it does faint to Sandslash, who outspeeds because of its ability Sand Rush along with Gigalith. But a few turns later, he brings another Meteor Beam Pokemon, Aurorus. Meteor Beam Rock Polish Aurorus forms a double Meteor Beam core, and even though it misses the Meteor Beam, it completely sweeps the rest of the game and has just enough speed to outspeed Sandslash even in the sand. Then, in the next PU game, we see the exact same team. Quillfish looks like it's going to be an extreme suicide lead, probably without a lot of attacking moves, and instead focusing on hazards and denying them with moves like Explosion. But it reveals Poison Jab to knock out the Rabombi, who got just a little bit greedy. It gets some damage on Sandslash and then sacrifices itself to get one layer of spikes before fainting. All in all, amazing value from the suicide lead. Archeops comes in and normally it can't take on the physically defensive Tangela, but with Meteor Beam it can. It forces in specially defensive Audino, but then Archeops reveals Taunt, which shuts down Audino. Even though it's a charge move, it can even go for another Meteor Beam because of how crippled a taunted Audino is. Archeops beats Audino and then eventually feints to Gigalith, but not before taking a huge chunk of damage off it. Now though, the team is extremely weak to Aurorus, and just like the last game, Aurorus cleans up the rest of the team, this time not even needing a Rock Polish. Aurorus and Quillfish are not particularly common Pokemon in the PU tier, so it was a showcase of using unexpected Pokemon to gain an advantage. Last but not the least, we have another somewhat stally team, but this time in PU, not UU. Lambo has a stally team, but Soulgazer has Centiskorch, which thrives on bulkier teams. Centiskorch has Fire Lash, which becomes difficult to switch into, and it also has Power Whip to hit water types like Quagsire. First, Soulgazer tricks a Choice Specs onto Audino to cripple one of the integral wall Pokemon of the team. Then he starts spreading status with moves like Will-O-Wisp and T-Spikes. T-Spikes is not immediately a game changer because of heavy duty boots, but it can be deadly if Pokemon get knocked off. The hazards put on the pressure, and then Centiskorch finds an opportunity to attack and hits Archeops with a predicted Power Whip, putting it in defeatist range. He saves Centiskorch for later and brings in Eldegoss as Archeops uses Stealth Rock. And here's a critical play. Eldegoss goes for Rapid Spin, as Glastrier uses Assurance trying to predict Doublade. The predict goes horribly wrong, and instead, Eldegoss removes hazards and has Eject button to go right back into Centiskorch. Archeops is too weak from the last time around, and Whimsicott gets sacrificed to Centiskorch. Then, as a finishing blow, Centiskorch gets the predict right and stays in on Archeops and uses Power Whip predicting Roost, knocking it out. Nothing else can take on Centiskorch anymore. There are some tricks left with Trick Room Audino into Glastrier, but it's never really threatening, and Stall gets destroyed by a 6-0 from Centiskorch and friends. Here are the standings after Week 2 with the top 4 making playoffs. My team is currently in 6th place after a bounce back win this week. Pokémon is on the Studio Gibbles in 7th place, and Blunder is on the Shoguns in 10th place. Also, if you've made it this far, here is a clip of Melmetal using Double Iron Bash versus Ferrothorn and losing half its health. Fortunately for TPP, he would later win the game with a nasty plot Moltres Galar. That's it for Week 2, let me know what your favorite Pokemon was from this week and what you want to see next in Week 3.